All right, welcome. This is the Something Venture podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. My guest today, Lylan Masterman. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Ken. How are you?
This is going to be great. We've been talking about Donald Trump a lot in the last few podcasts for different reasons. And we're going to turn our thoughts this time to the north and talk about Canada a little bit, investing in Canada.
Justin Trudeau.
It's going to be Justin Trudeau, right?
Yeah.
Who is the son of Pierre Trudeau, right?
Indeed.
He is your president. Oh, well, you're not.
Hey, now. Hey. Yeah. Prime Minister.
For your oh, sorry about that. Oh, man. Is Canada one of those places like... Don't be offensive to Canada, but we're like they look to the U.S. a lot, but we don't spend enough time thinking about them. Like you get that down in like New Zealand.
You can't Americanize the world here.
Oh man,
we have our own thing. It's going really well in Canada. We like what we're doing.
Yeah. So you guys aren't on board with the America First thing.
I don't think any other country should be.
There's a really funny video of I think the Netherlands or somebody in the Netherlands put it out where they're like, okay, but could Netherlands be second?
Yeah, I saw that video.
It's pretty good.
Yeah.
Anyway, so you were with White Star Capital, which I'll let you explain that. So I don't botch it. You have worked at Merrill Lynch, been involved in over $10 billion of transactions. Is that right?
That's my colleague Eric Martineau-Fortin.
So give me your background.
Let me cover you a little bit here. So personally, I'm born and raised in Cornwall, Ontario, Canada, which is a town an hour west of Montreal.
Yeah.
40,000 people. Until a few days ago, I thought I was the only investor from Cornwall. And then, we're recording this a day after SaaStr ended. And at SaaStr, I met two other investors from Cornwall, Ontario, which was like, what?
Hey, come on.
So that was kind of cool. After Cornwall, I did my undergrad at University of Waterloo, which a lot of Bay Area people are very familiar with. Moved to Seattle, was part of the first team at Microsoft to launch VisualStudio.net.
Yep.
Then I went to a startup that boomed and busted, but we've got a lot of great awards. Where the product was similar to what Yammer is today.
Yeah.
But this was like in 2002, 2003. We didn't know what the freemium model was.
Yeah.
And then after that, I went to a company called Avenue A or aQuantive.
Yeah, sure.
Spent 5 amazing years of my life learning how to really scale a business, double and triple the business year over year. And then, Microsoft acquired us for $6 billion. It was the largest acquisition ever at the time by Microsoft. I had some data that actually said that we were larger than all of Microsoft's prior acquisitions combined, which is like awesome. And then Skype came in and a few others came in after us. Did my MBA at Kellogg. And then it was there that...
Which, by the way, in Silicon Valley is the equivalent of being from Canada. Like, if I meet somebody and I guess that they went to MBA school at Harvard or Stanford with a couple people who went to Princeton undergrad, 95% of the time. So there's a few people in Silicon Valley from Kellogg.
Yeah.
Sam Shank, who founded Hotel Tonight, went to Kellogg. Gil Pincina, he's like an investor extraordinaire, went there.
He's mentored me.
Yeah.
Todd Francis,
right?
Yeah.
But there's like... I'm sure there's a lot.
Yeah.
But there's like 5 of them compared to like 5,000. We're like the Nova Scotia of MBA schools.
And, Kellogg was awesome for me in that I came from such a geeky undergrad that it was great for people looking at my resume to say, all right, he's not all pure geek.
Yeah.
Right?
And Kellogg does something. Here's my ad for Kellogg. When I went, they did something interesting, which was it's a marketing school. So every student... you rated all the professors.
Yeah.
And the professors were there because they had a good rating. Yeah. So you could be to pick on University of Chicago, but you could just be a great researcher and be a professor there. But from a student whether or not you're a good teacher didn't matter. And Kellogg was like, we're just going to have the best teachers. Yeah. So I felt like every professor I had was just like the woman who taught me accounting, I thought was the most fascinating, wonderful professor. So I'm a fan.
My favorite class I ever took at Kellogg was a class that was invented by the professor. She created it, Yale Hochberg, and the name of the class was Cases in Venture Capital.
Oh, really?
And so in a way, a lot of students thought that she worked the least of any professor, but she actually worked the most because what she did, it was one class, 3 hours a week, but it was really 4 hours. Yeah. And at the end of the class, she'd give us a real life business plan, pitch deck or whatever from a startup with some questions. Right. And then the following week, the real life VC and sometimes a real life entrepreneur would fly into Chicago and tell us what really happened and would tell us how our analysis was either spot on or fucked up.
That's cool.
Right? And it was really humbling. We had this one assignment on due diligence, and then there was a second and a third one, and it just got smacked into us. I'm like, guys, Stop worrying about like this laundry list of due diligence items.
Right.
What are legitimately the 2 or 3 things that could really just kill this business?
Right.
Stop worrying about the extra 57.
Yeah.
Right. And it's the kind of thing that it's accelerated learning, and that's what business school is about, is accelerated learning.
Well, and the other thing that Kellogg did was everything. When I went there, everything was a group project.
Yeah, oh
like
my
5 or 6,
gosh.
including your accounting class.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, this sucks. I got to deal with this guy, and he's a dick, and then this person doesn't carry their weight, and you're like, oh, that's all of life and business.
It really,
and so
really
you can't
is.
just be smart by yourself. You have to, which is why the consulting firms like Kellogg and that kind of thing. But we had entrepreneur classes. It was kind of funny. These guys would show up, and clearly they were leading lovely lifestyles, and they'd made $100 million selling their company. Yeah. But they didn't really have much to say. They're like, I don't know. I dropped out of college. You know, we're all in our second year of a $100,000 MBA. Drop out of college and just do it. You know, it was a lot, and learn accounting and all this stuff. They didn't really have any of these magic formulas, basically. And this was kind of before lean startup had become a concept of here's roughly, fail quickly, get a lot of experiments done, don't run out of cash. And there was like one VC firm in Chicago. I don't even know if they're around. It was called Frontenac. It was this weird, like back in the 80s and 90s when VC wasn't even like. Wall Street was cool back then.
Right. At Kellogg, we had Harry Kramer, who was a former CEO of a Fortune 50 company, Baxter, right? And so the dean, this was 2 deans ago, went to Harry and said, Harry, like, come and teach any class you want at Kellogg because you're one of our best alumni. And Harry used to be a CFO, and he's a finance major, and the dean thought that Harry was going to teach a finance class. And instead, Harry wanted to teach a class that was going to be the most meaningful possible. And so his career is all about the human element and managerial leadership and dealing with people. Yeah. And so he's like, I'm creating my own class on managerial leadership. And he taught us to do an exercise. And I took his class in 2009, right? So this is 7 or 8 years later. Yeah. I just redid that same exercise over the holidays, which is be honest with yourself, create a spreadsheet of how your 168 hours in a week are spent on average, right? And include your sleep time, but don't forget to include the time for falling asleep and waking up. That's got to be included too. Include your personal hygiene time, like include your commuting time, include everything so you're being honest with yourself. Because the first time you try to do this exercise, Kent,
right,
you end up at like 289 hours.
right.
And you're like, okay, I'm not superhuman. And this was the impact of having a great professor.
Yeah. And they say about MBA school too, that it's not necessarily for the time that you're in school. It's for 10 years later.
Yeah.
So in school, you're like, come on, that would never happen. Nobody would ever do that. And then you're running a business. You're like, oh, that guy just did that thing that, theoretically,
what's really different about your experience versus my experience is that you went to business school, a year or 2 after your undergrad?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I was already in my 30s.
Which is smart. It was weird. I applied. I don't know how I got in that early.
Yeah,
it was weird because there was all these people who were showing up, and I'd worked at a bank for a year, and everyone else was like, I run Pepsi Latin America, or something
right?
Like that. And they had all this experience, and I was like, when you're that age, everything's super. You just tell the guy this, and the sales guy will do that, and the older guy's like, you wish, you wish life worked that way.
We saw that in Harry's class because he was giving such advanced interpersonal advice that all of us in our 30s. We were like, oh my God, that's genius.
Yeah.
And a lot of the kids that were your age, right?
Yeah.
They're like, of course.
Yeah, right.
And they didn't really understand how challenging some of these lessons were.
Yeah. And the other thing I learned was people from overseas smoke a lot too.
Oh my. You didn't know that before?
I was reminded.
Yeah.
So how did you end up becoming an investor? This is the.
Yeah. So actually it ties into the continuation. So in 2007, I reached out to Mike Elgin, one of the co-founders of aQuantive, and just for some career advice, some advice about applying to business school, all that stuff. And keep in mind, in 2007, the web was not what it is today. There was no Fred Wilson blog. There was no Brad Fell blog. It was hard to educate yourself on this kind of venture capital. Yeah. And so I was just getting Mike's advice, and Mike was telling about how he started aQuantive, and he was with a few classmates, and they started this thing, and then they had a few other classmates who went into VC, and I said, "What's VC?" right? And then he told me what VC was, and I'm like, oh, I think I'd be good at that.
Yeah.
And I think I'd like it. And Mike says, no, you would be good, but you can't. That's the dark side. Fast forward, the reason I went to Kellogg was to build up the appropriate skills in finance, in marketing, in strategy, because VCs need to do that. And I was a computer science geek. I didn't know any of that stuff.
Right.
And
what was your first computer?
Commodore VIC-20.
Okay.
Yeah.
That seems to be the answer for a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, the Commodore 64 was what the rich kids had.
Yeah.
And
right.
the VIC-20 was the affordable model.
Yeah. It's funny. I interviewed somebody on the podcast who was an immigrant back when that was cool. Came over from China and worked his way up to buying his Commodore by washing dishes. Founds this company called Genie, and I was doing a podcast with him that was kind of like the entrepreneur's struggle and how he worked so hard and it wasn't going to really work out. And then a few weeks later, I get a note from him. It's like, Microsoft has acquired his company.
Yeah.
And he's now an AI guy. So I went from
Right.
this immigrant with his Commodore to Microsoft just bought your company.
Yeah.
You're now a big part of their AI thing. So.
But my second computer is one that I don't hear many people answer. It was the Coleco Atom Family Pack.
Oh man, I thought you were gonna say K-Pro.
No.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that computer.
I haven't either.
Yeah.
I've heard Commodore, and then you get if I talk to younger people, it's an Apple II.
Yeah. So when my uncle got me that computer, or gave it to me as a hand-me-down, we were told that there might be something called a modem in it, right?
Oh boy.
And he was like, call your local library, and they'll give you this phone number, and then you can call and access books. Yeah. And so I called my library, and the lovely librarian, she says, oh, honey, listen, if that existed, then libraries would not exist anymore.
That's funny.
Yeah.
And those were the days of computing. What I loved when there were modems and when the internet first started, you'd Gopher in or Waze in or whatever it was called.
Yeah.
It's when I was much more aware of the physicality of the internet. You'd be in your little house in San Diego, where I grew up, and then you log into a computer and you're like, oh my God, I'm in a computer in the University of Michigan.
Yeah.
And I'm here, and a computer over there is doing that. That was so and now you're like, who the hell knows?
I remember running over to the kitchen and getting my parents. I wanted to show them. Mm-hmm. And so I showed them, and they weren't impressed.
Yeah, exactly. Oh man. Okay, the Coleco, that's a good one.
And so at Kellogg, what I did is I basically networked my ass off.
Yeah.
And I didn't know anything about reaching out to people. Just simply this, I was in first year. The second years told me, here's what you need to do. You're in Chicago, which is the middle of nowhere. It's swampland for VC, with all due respect to some of my mentors who were there who are awesome.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And so simply what I did is I looked up every single VC firm I could find. There were no real databases back then. Mm-hmm. And looked up the bios of every partner and principal and emailed the one person. I didn't spam everyone in a firm. I get these emails sometimes. It's ridiculous. I identified one person, and I would email that person with the very, very polite version of the email. Hey, we've got this in common. I think your career is awesome. Can we chat?
Yep.
Right? And just did it over and over and over and over again. And I met some awesome people there, and that's actually, I reached out to some Kellogg alum that we mentioned earlier, like Gil and Todd and so on.
Right.
One of the people I reached out to was a Northwestern alum who was a co-founder of a competitor of mine when I was at aQuantive. He was a co-founder of 24/7 Real Media. Mm-hmm. And he was in New York, but with a Canadian firm, Inovia.
Okay.
Right? And so I reached out to him for those three reasons. I could have reached out to one of the Canadians, right? But Northwestern and the ad tech aspect. So I reached out to him, and we had a great call. And at the end of the call, he said, Lylan, I don't have any space for you for an internship. I like you. I want to see you succeed. Let me introduce you to a friend of mine. That friend was Mark Fernandez at Sierra Ventures, right? Mm-hmm. So then Mark's admin writes me back, and she says, hey, Mark would be happy to have a call. I did what you're trained to do. Lie. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a call would be great, but I'm actually going to be in the Bay Area in 2 weeks. Yep. We schedule it. And of course, 2 weeks because flights are cheaper, and I was on a student budget. And then I booked my flight, flew out to the Bay Area, met Mark. Before we even sit down, Mark tells me, Lylan, listen, I'm happy to give you advice and all. We've never really done an internship. We don't plan to, but I know what the email said, candidate for summer senior associate, but no. And I'm like, Mark, no problem. Right. And then we sit down, have a good conversation. He really liked the fact I was already in my 30s, that he wouldn't need to manage me.
Right.
Right. And he saw I was passionate about what I was doing. And he said, at the end of the meeting, he's like, let me talk to my partners.
Yeah.
And I knew it, right? I had it. And so he gave me an exercise. I knocked it out of the park. And then it was through that experience that I applied for and was selected for the Kauffman Fellows program.
Wow.
And we can talk about that if you want, but ultimately it was, at the time, nothing more than a great thing to put on my resume, because I didn't actually do the program until several years later.
Right.
And so, graduated, bad economy. I had one offer in VC, and my mentors told me to turn it down. So I did. And I went back to being head of product, head of engineering. And then Eric, the guy we talked about earlier in this call, Eric was having a conversation with the same guy from that Canadian firm, Inovia. And Eric told that guy, listen, I'm looking for someone who's the polar opposite of me. Because Eric, as you were mentioning earlier, was a former pinstriped M&A investment banker, right?
Yeah.
And so he wanted someone who was a product geek, who understood, who was a computer science person, but also had a passion for venture capital. So it was that one person who made an intro for me in 2009 to Sierra Ventures, and then a second intro for me in 2014.
Yeah.
And that's how I got connected with Eric.
It's so funny how it works. And so I don't know if Wall Street works this way or not. I suspect not as much, but it's just funny. Like, you just take these random meetings that you don't know, and then all of a sudden it's, oh, hey, do you want to join me for this? And you're on to some adventure. It's the craziest career.
Yeah. And that's why when people email me and it's a copy and pasted email, I'm busy, I archive it, right?
Right.
But if I sense any level of personalization, any attempt at doing a little bit of research, I'm responsive. And especially if there's some kind of attachment. And the attachment can be really, really loose, right?
Yeah.
I'm a hockey fan. Okay, let's talk, right?
Exactly.
It's that simple.
Well, that's the joke in Silicon Valley is if you say to somebody, hey, I want to pitch my company to you, they're like, oh, okay, I'm available in 9 weeks, whatever. If you say, hey, I want to sit down, I just want your thoughts on how to do something. Okay, tomorrow I'll be in the city, let's catch up. The defenses come down.
They really, really, really do.
So how do you end up being an investor then who's not focused in Silicon? There's this concept that I've been exploring. Silicon Valley is the center of the world, like for a certain thing. Like everything happens here. People try to start companies other places and start ecosystems other places, and Mark Zuckerberg still comes to Silicon Valley. Like how do you end up not being, you're on the path to venture capital, why not just be on the path to being the next first round benchmark associate kind of guy?
First round, you mean?
First round capital.
Yeah, you mean the firm in Philly and New York.
Oh, well, that's fair.
Thanks for setting me up. Yeah. White Star was named after the first cruise line across the Atlantic, White Star Lines. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And so it was part of our DNA from day one to be that transatlantic firm. Yeah. And so we started that way, and that was always our mission.
But why? Like an interest in being in those places, or a competitive advantage of being in London when there's not 1 billion people, or what was the? Because it's hard. I mean, you got to travel and you got to have multiple offices. Yeah. The weather sucks.
I have lobbied for us to open an office in Hawaii. Yeah. Haven't quite gotten that approved yet. And Ottawa, Canada, in the middle of February.
I hear it's horrible.
Shivers down to the bones. But ultimately, a lot about this business and many other businesses, it's about timing, right? And you look at the timing of when these cities that we invest in are having its own hockey stick, right? And I can legitimately use that term. I'm Canadian.
Good use of it,
right? Yeah. And these cities, they are expanding very, very quickly. And so if you want to be an investor into the next Shopify, into the next Spotify, right? So on and so forth, they're all internationally, right? And so there's all these great opportunities that we invest in at lower valuations. And it's the whole same spiel that everyone says internationally, right? Yeah. Lower valuations, lower employee turnover, greater employee loyalty, easier to recruit the talent, a lot of tax breaks, and Canada's great for the tax breaks. It's the right moment. It's the right time.
Yeah. Well, theoretically, actually, everybody in the world can't be in Silicon Valley. No. Like, every engineer can't be here. There's just not that much physical space. Like, there is some limit to it.
Yeah, and driving around this city, the traffic is already insane. Yeah. So, it can't all be here. But then, a lot of people don't want to live here. I drafted a blog post on this. I don't know when I'll publish it. But at the end of the day, a lot of people are choosing to move away. A lot of people have talked about that already.
Yeah.
And there are good reasons for people to want to live elsewhere too.
Yeah.
Right? Family, weather. San Francisco weather is not all that great.
It's horrible.
Right?
Yeah.
Lifestyle. One of the things I love about New York versus Bay Area is that New York has the best professional diversity of any city I've ever lived in.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? When you're at dinner and, we're all like, our dinner tables are always stuck beside one each other, right?
Yeah, it's like that here.
Yeah. And you overhear the people to your right.
Yeah, and they're in the fashion industry.
Yeah, and the people to your left are talking about media or finance or hospitals or health, whatever, right? Here in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
We know what they're talking about.
LA's like that too. It's all Hollywood in LA.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that is true. Like I overhear a conversation. Like I literally, people should watch it. I literally recognize the names of the people they're talking about. Like, oh, I know who that guy is. Who you had a meeting with earlier today.
Yeah. And there's something very, very joyful about not spending an entire dinner talking about one single topic.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Right. Or one single vertical.
Yeah.
And that every time I come visit in San Francisco, that almost always ends up happening.
Yeah.
And I know my friends would be like, "Oh, come on, Lylan, that's not true."
Yeah.
But it's different in New York.
Yeah. Oh man, I blew the bet. So Commodore was founded in Toronto.
I just lost some Canadian points there because I did not remember that.
Well, I did some preparation for this podcast and I was listening, and somebody said that Commodore and Atari were founded in Toronto, and so I checked that with my two of the people at Nuzzle, which is a 6-person company from Canada. Yeah. And they were like, yes, Commodore did start in Toronto before it moved. The Atari thing we could not verify, though. That does not seem to have been started in Toronto. So Commodore, like in the 50s or something as a calculator company or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But I blew that one. But great company. I mean, BlackBerry, they've gone through their thing, but that was Canadian. Obviously, Hootsuite, I think.
Yeah, Hootsuite is.
Canadian. 500px, whiwhich I don't know what that is. I've never used it, but every VC acts like it's the coolest thing they've ever seen.
Yeah, it's 500px all around photography and publishing photography, yeah. And
then FreshBooks, I think.
Yeah.
Is a big deal.
But like Wattpad, Kik, Frank and Oak.
Kik, really?
And then like Maluba just got acquired by Microsoft. And that was a decent acquisition. Luxury Retreats just got acquired yesterday.
Really?
Yeah, by Airbnb.
Oh, nice.
Right?
Wow.
And so there's a lot of action. Lightspeed POS.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't talk about it. It's B2B, all that kind of stuff, but they're killing it. And then we've got some companies that are just doing amazing also. So here's like an interesting, one of our companies in Toronto, Drop. Mm-hmm. They're taking a business model that's never really succeeded in the US, but it's succeeded in Canada. It has succeeded in Sweden and in England. And so their whole approach is launch the app in Canada, get a little bit of momentum, test the app a little bit. And a lot of US companies do this. Mm-hmm. Within 4 months of launch, they've hit number 3 in the Canadian App Store.
Yeah.
Right? Isn't that a good time now to start hitting up the Silicon Valley VCs and saying, hey, right? And this is happening over and over again with the Canadian companies.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's that used to be a good App Store, call it trick, but where you could, go to Finland or something and buy a bunch of downloads in Finland and get up to like number 2. And then the theory was that the other App Store people would recognize you. And so where in Canada are they, here they're, 90% in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and then 10% New York, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Are they all? Is Toronto like where they are?
I think you're underselling New York there, but I'll allow you to have your Silicon Valley bias.
That's our view of the world.
I know it is. I know. I got like. You didn't do your research on New York there, but on Canada. So Ontario, Canada is, if you consider the states and the provinces of North America, Ontario's number 4.
Oh, wow.
Right, and so it's really impressive. And then Quebec is number 9, I believe.
Really?
And so it's. And
then what Vancouver?
In British Columbia?
Yeah.
I think they're like down at number 16 or so.
Because they're right next to Seattle.
Yeah.
They're...
Yeah, they are. Like, I lived in Seattle for 7 years.
Okay, yeah.
So, like, the quick data, right, there's 459 companies in Canada that raised last year, totaling $3.7 billion.
Really?
Right? And so the stats are, and I'll just walk down the top 4. California, $35 billion.
Okay.
New York, $8 billion. Massachusetts, $7 billion. And in Ontario's at $1.8 billion. and Quebec's at 1.1 billion.
Wow.
Right? And so that puts Ontario number 4, and this is Thomson Reuters data.
Right.
And it's like, and also Canada itself, the amount of funding in Canada grew 36% from 2015 to 2016. Wow. And I expect the same thing in 2017.
So who would a Canadian entrepreneur be? Is it somebody from, Waterloo who stays and starts something, or somebody from the U.S. who says, I'm tired of Silicon Valley? Like who is an entrepreneur in Canada who makes the decision not to, the founder of our company got the hell out and came to work at Netscape.
Yeah,
here.
And I did the same thing too, right?
Yeah.
But the times are changing, and now is a great place for Canadians to stay in Canada.
Yeah, for sure.
Like if I was graduating from undergrad now, I would probably stay.
Interesting.
Because back then, I could have gone to Blackberry, but Waterloo is not the city that it is today. Yeah. Toronto was not the city that it is today. So Toronto is now the 4th most populated city in North America. Yeah. Right? And it's an amazing city. It's so much fun. It's so similar to Chicago in many ways. Yeah. And so your typical entrepreneur in Canada is fairly similar to your typical entrepreneur in New York, in that they may have come from any kind of professional background. Yeah. Because Toronto itself has great people in fintech, in media, in fashion, in commerce. And so you have that professional diversification in Toronto like we have in New York. Mm-hmm. And similarly in Montreal, although Montreal is focusing a little bit more heavily on AI and ML. Toronto's also great with it, but there's a lot of activity going on there.
AI is hot.
Yeah. Montreal has some awesome people in gaming also. And it's like Ubisoft's office. And my colleague, JF, he was a co-founder of a social gaming company. Right. And they have 400 people in Montreal now.
Wow.
Right? And so, yeah.
So what is the thing Mark Andreessen talks about this, and I don't think he means Canada, but the people who come from overseas to tour Silicon Valley. Yeah. And they're like, we want to build one of these in Singapore. He's like, well, you need to change your labor laws. You need to change your bankruptcy laws. You need to make sure that there's no, stigma around. He lists like 10 things. Like, well, we don't want to do that. Like, what can we do? He's like, well, it's not going to work then. But what is it that the Canadian government did to encourage? Didn't they do something?
Yeah, so there's a few key things. One is the tax credits for the companies. So there are programs called SHRED and IRAP. Don't worry about what the terms mean, but ultimately...
Those are pretty cool terms, though.
Yeah, SHRED, right?
Yeah, I want that.
Yeah, I'm going to shred it. Yeah. But SHRED ultimately is for your R&D budget. So you get tax credits in cash. You get cash back for hiring engineers that are doing R&D. Yeah. And this is a very significant, ultimately, depending on the company, depending on the structure, 30, 40, 50% of the engineers' salaries are reimbursed to you by the government.
Wow.
And then there's all kinds of grants for hiring interns, for hiring PhDs, for doing specific kinds of research. Right. And then in British Columbia, investors get a tax credit for investing in early stages. Right. Really? That's not a nationwide thing, and I'm not an expert because I don't live in BC and never have, but that's really cool. And then there's a program called VCAP, and that's where the government assigned money to a bunch of fund of funds, right, to invest into Canadian VCs. Okay. And so that's helped foster, capital is important. Right. There's a lot of people who've done tons of research on what creates an ecosystem, and I've observed it in New York. Right, from being just like, double click and meetup.com or whatever, to now New York being much larger than you give it credit for. And the Canadian cities will do the same thing. Toronto Waterloo is already on its way. Right. And everyone calls it Toronto Waterloo, and it's like an hour and a half drive in between. Feels similar to San Francisco Palo Alto in a way, right? And it's partially... I hope people don't get pissed off at me for saying this. Waterloo is where all the brains are, and Toronto is where all the networking and money is. Mm-hmm. Right? And so you need to leverage the two of them together. And so there's actually a lot of companies in Toronto Waterloo that have two offices, one for engineering, one for business. Right. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's not that dissimilar. I mean, back in the day, San Francisco was the financial capital. Yeah. I mean, it still happens, but it was a financial district in San Francisco. Yeah. And then the tech companies started in the South, and they kind of figured out, the Rockefellers started Venrock, and they kind of found each other. Yeah. Like it was a massive wealth creation.
So you watched The Men Who Built America, or The Men Who Made America?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that was so good.
Yeah.
That PBS six episodes. Yeah.
Those things are so good.
Yeah.
What That's really interesting that the government had a little bit of a role in like is there a play for U.S. companies to move things up there? Like the film industry does for sure.
Yeah.
Like L.A. films stuff in Canada all the time. For financial
absolutely.
Reasons.
There are a good number of U.S. companies that have large Canadian engineering teams. Mm-hmm. It requires a little bit of legal costs and accounting costs to structure things in the right way to qualify.
Right.
But there are many, many, many. And they tend to like to go to Montreal a little bit more than Toronto, Waterloo because salaries are just a little bit lower.
Interesting.
But the language is, people in Montreal, like they speak English, right? Like engineers do. And so it's a great city to go to. And we see that over and over and over again. I tried to do it back in the day. So back when I was a head of product, head of engineering, I was managing a 50-person engineering team in Kiev, Ukraine, right?
Wow.
Or as they say, Kyiv. And it was when your entire engineering team is abroad, so many time zones away with such cultural differences, it's a major challenge. And then I looked into whether I could open up an office in Toronto. I was choosing Toronto because I wanted people who spoke Russian, engineers who spoke Russian, to work with the team in Kiev. And so I compared how much it would cost my company to hire an engineer in Toronto after tax credits versus the engineers in Kiev, the good ones. The inexpensive ones in Kiev, they're quite inexpensive. Right. But the good ones are expensive.
Yeah.
And it was coming out to basically being equal costs.
Yeah.
So I was like, why wouldn't I want to have people in the same time zone that can do a 1-hour flight to New York?
Yep.
And no cultural differences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I've been through that experience where you put people. We had an office in the Philippines, and by the time you saved the salary, but you had the different skill level and the communication stuff, you're like, you might as well hire 5 guys here. In that case, a little bit different math. 5 guys here than 10 guys there, and you'll be better. That's why I think you've got to be a big company like Microsoft, where you're like, okay, we can put 10,000 engineers in India and then send over all the management that requires. Having 3 guys in India is like, life's too short.
Yeah,
it's tough.
I never want my entire engineering team to be abroad. So you can do around-the-clock development, and there are great ways to make that work. But when it's your entire team, that they're too disjoint.
Yeah.
One thing about Canada, and be it Montreal, be it Toronto, Waterloo, be it Vancouver, and even some of the smaller cities like Ottawa, I'm sure you saw this word over and over again when you did your research: talent. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely crazy how the University of Waterloo, University of Toronto, McGill, Queen's, et cetera, are producing such amazing talent. And then it's not just all new recent grads, right? People have been going to these schools for decades.
Right.
And so there was a year that Microsoft hired, and back when Microsoft was like the it company before like Google came around and so on, there was a year that Microsoft hired more people from the University of Waterloo than any other school in the world.
Wow.
And then that hit the Canadian press, and the journalists had a field day with it, that Microsoft was a large contributor to the Canadian brain drain. And so I don't know if this is true, but the story goes that Bill Gates had to have a meeting with the head of HR and said, every year from here on out, our number 1 school we recruit from must always be an American school.
Interesting.
And then LinkedIn took down a page, but they had it up for a long time. LinkedIn had a page of Google, Microsoft, LinkedIn, Facebook, a couple other companies, and what schools their employees came from. Every one of those companies, it was just the top 5 schools. There were 4 American schools and University of Waterloo for every single one of those companies.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm surprised they care that much. I mean, if everyone's in Seattle, that's like Canada anyway, as far as I can tell from here. So what is the connection? Is there like as we've learned recently, Canada has different sort of immigration things than the United States.
And the startup visa is quite special in Canada. I'm not an expert on it, but Trudeau's administration has made a very strong appeal to say, if you want to be an entrepreneur and you want to create jobs and you want to hire all kinds of people who are going to pay taxes and pay a lot of taxes, come to Canada.
Wow.
Right?
You guys have like the opposite government of what we have now.
Really, really is. And what was kind of odd is that Obama and Trudeau felt like they were brothers from a different mother.
Yeah.
They looked like they were so friendly together.
It's kind of like the progressive fantasy. Like,
right?
Yeah, bring in people who create jobs.
Yeah.
That's. And is Asia like it's a big connection for Canada, right?
It is, and it's going to grow too.
Yeah.
On the one hand, Canada is part of the Commonwealth. Mm-hmm. So we also have the attachments to the UK, to Australia, and so on. But if you go to Vancouver, you definitely just visually see the impact that Asia's had there. And it's a little bit everywhere. Yeah. I'm trying to partner more with Asian companies and Asian firms.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's some reason, right? Like, wasn't it people leaving Taiwan, or there's some reason that Vancouver is so many Asian people and wealthy ones too.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly. There's something that was going on where they're moving. I mean, it's happening everywhere, all over America. Chinese money is moving. We're trying to get the hell out of China just to diversify.
So I don't know the exact details of this, but what I do understand, there was a serious problem in Vancouver until a few months ago where the price of rent was too high. Yeah. And yet there was so much property. And it was because there was a lot of investment property that was vacant.
New York's got that going on too, I've heard.
Yeah. And so from what I understand, the city of Vancouver passed a tax that basically if you own property in Vancouver and it's not habited, then you're taxed. Yeah. Right? So please, owners of property in Vancouver, please rent your properties. Yeah. Right? And I like that. It's good. It's social good.
It's so funny to be so rich that you're like, yeah, I got a place. I'm not going to rent it out for $5,000 a month. Or whatever. It's like, wow. Yeah. I think there's parts of Manhattan where I think, Russian and Chinese money, it's just like the new Swiss bank account, buy some property in Manhattan. It's not going anywhere. And, but it's empty. Yeah. And so these buildings that people say are like a third dark, during the week. And it's because of that.
I've seen it, right? Like I have friends who've dated people who are from those kinds of families. And they're like, I come to New York 3 days a year, and it's beautiful. I have my house, and it's always clean and all that. It's like, whoa. Yeah. And then, of course, it's the most amazing pad. Yeah. Right? The greatest views and all that. And you're like, oh, my God, and this place is empty.
And Vancouver's a lovely place, too.
It really, really, really is.
Beautiful. What do you expect? What tech companies? I'm surprised by the size of the venture. I knew it was.
I don't want to tell everybody. I want it to be our little secret at White Star, and we can just keep on capitalizing.
What's that like? So what's the competition like as an investor? If something comes up, the hot new Hootsuite or whatever in Canada, are you pretty good shot you're in, or is benchmark swoop in from the U.S., or how does that?
So both, right? Within the Canadian firms, we have a lot of respect for our friends at Inovia. Right. And of course, I'm a little biased because it's Inovia that introduced me to White Star. But with Chris Arsenault, the team that he's built at Inovia is amazing. And they are in many of the winners. And so we're very friendly with Inovia. We want to invest together. But we know that they're highly regarded in Canada. And then Georgian at the much later stage. Right, Series C, Series D. There's a firm called Georgian that did Shopify and did a few others, and they're also investing in the U.S. What's really interesting is the best Canadian firms are active in the U.S. Because ultimately, if you're the VC down the street and your network is primarily Canada, it's hard as an investor to be really helpful to your portfolio companies, right? You want to have that global network because that's what the Canadian CEO needs, right? It's how does someone from Toronto have a global network? And Toronto's a fantastic, large city, but you want to have those extra resources of that global network, and so that's why most of the best Canadian firms have that presence externally. We've taken the opposite angle. We are not a Canadian firm. We are an international firm, right? So I'm in New York, and I have colleagues in London and Paris, and so we're an international firm that chooses to invest in Canada and be very, very active in Canada, have an office there, because we see all the opportunities. Yeah. And there isn't all that much deal flow, so there's not really much proprietary deal flow in Canada.
Are there seed firms? We've got 1 billion seed firms here, literally 1 billion in Silicon Valley. Is it the kind of the seed firms there too, or is it more like still the friends and family?
Well, there's the friends and family, and then there's the accelerators and incubators. There's Mars in New York. There's Communitech in Waterloo, doing great things. There's a pretty highly regarded seed investor in Toronto, Matt Golden, Golden Ventures, and then Real Ventures is a quite large firm in Montreal and in Toronto, and they do a lot of seed deals.
Okay.
Maybe smaller checks, but ultimately they have great purview over the Canadian ecosystem.
Yeah.
Their model reminds me somewhat of Dave McClure here.
Yeah, who now
right?
Dave McClure of 500 Startups now has a Canadian.
There's a 500 Canada now too.
It's kind of big. It's like 30 million or something.
Yeah. For first time fun and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. It sounds like here in Silicon Valley, a few years ago, when there used to be fewer seed firms that were kind of in everything.
Yep.
And now there's a lot of seed firms that are in everything, but there's much more diversity of seed firms.
Absolutely.
And it's kind of a sweet time too, when you just have to talk to a few guys and you're going to hear about every deal that's kind of coming through.
But YC is so active in Canada.
Really?
And they've been very vocal about their admiration for University of Waterloo, to the point where I've heard people talk over beers that the bar is lower for Waterloo people to get into YC.
Oh, interesting.
Because it's like, okay, it's just, you're legit.
Is it kind of like our University of Illinois would be? That's our big, right? That's like Max Levchin went there, and Mark Andreessen.
And then I was told the newest batch of 500 Startups US, I was told has 7 Canadian companies.
Right? Could be. They're
and so
big international. I think they're probably looking to China to open something up there. I mean, they're really interesting.
And so there are a lot. And then pretty much a lot of the great U.S. investors have 1 or 2 companies in Canada.
Yeah.
So Fred Wilson's got some. Mark Fernandez gave me my first break in VC. He's active in Toronto.
So what could go wrong for the Toronto ecosystem? Is there anything with the current U.S. government immigration policy that wouldn't cause you any trouble?
It would help Toronto.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
More talent going to Toronto.
Yeah.
Right. More international talent. That'd be a great thing for Toronto and Montreal. Yeah.
What companies are you excited about in Canada? What should people be, looking at that we don't really know about in the U.S., but is like an exciting company from an investment standpoint?
Yeah, there's a company called Nubo. It's a funny name.
Yeah.
MNUBO.
Oh boy.
All right.
Yeah. That's all right.
It's 5 letters.
Yeah, Google's goofy.
Getting a 5-letter.com is hard.
Yeah.
And the team that they put together around data science for the Internet of Things is amazing. And what's typical of Canadian companies in general is that their product actually does what they say they do. Right? Because Canadians are not much to overemphasize things or overstate things, And so Nubo's solution does...
Like I said, the opposite of here.
Right.
Oh, yeah, I'm changing the world. I haven't built it yet, but...
That's why Canadian B2B companies are able to win time and time again in bake-offs, right? Now, could they use some enterprise salespeople that know how to play that game a little bit more? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's an area for development for Canada.
Yeah.
But in terms of the technology being the best possible, Canadian companies win the bake-offs over and over and over again. That's what Nubo is doing.
That's interesting.
Right? Just because the data science is real, the product is real, and then the understanding of the use cases to make the customer successful.
Yeah.
Right? Because you could say that Canada maybe has less of that, let's just build the next social network or the next search engine, and if you build it, they will come kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the Canadian entrepreneurs, they look at use cases. And when I go up there and I get pitched, I don't need to ask the same kind of questions I ask here.
Yeah. I think that's a little unique. That's a California thing where we have Hollywood and we have everyone here is creating some crazy I'm going to change the world and Snapchat. If you talk to the LA ecosystem is like that where all the companies are they're not that crazy. They're like Dollar Shave Club, right?
Yeah, we invested in that.
Razors. Oh, hey, congratulations. We sell razors and they cost $10 a month, and so you can acquire people for $50. Or they have a film editing platform. Nobody's I don't know, I'm doing this crazy thing that's going to let people trade, their old stuff. That's kind of a Silicon Valley thing, and that's why you get Snapchat and Facebook.
And there's that bowling pin analogy, right? You want to get to the back pins. But to get to those back pins, you have to hit the front pin first. Mm-hmm. So, for example, Dollar Shave Club, they were tackling the entire men's bathroom. the shampoo, the conditioner, the body wash, the face cream, the face scrub, everything, right? And so that's kind of like maybe not the back row of pins, maybe it's the second to last.
Yeah.
But the first pin was the razor blades.
Yeah.
Right. And that's just a beautiful model. Get in, get that user base, and then build it. So you can have this great vision, this grand vision, but you start with something more pragmatic to begin with.
Yeah, I do think Silicon Valley compared to the rest of the world, Canada is sort of we have a lot more crazy ideas.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at the things coming out of Australia, like XERO, Zero Accounting. It's a $1 billion company. They just kind of built it, and it's kind of practical, and it's like better accounting software, supposedly, than QuickBooks. And it's much more pragmatic entrepreneurship than our, you know, I don't know, I'm trying this, I'm pivoting to that.
And when you see the financial forecast, so I've seen this evolve. So the comment I'm making now is more about Canadian entrepreneurs in 2011 than 2017. But in 2011, when I would see a deck from a Canadian entrepreneur and the financial forecasts, these are not forecasts that you'd ever want to discount, right? These are probably the numbers that they're probably going to hit.
Wow.
And so over time, the Canadian entrepreneurs are learning to be a little bit more aggressive because the US VCs always discount the numbers anyways. They assume you're being as aggressive as the San Francisco entrepreneur, and then your company looks like shit, right? And so the Canadian entrepreneurs are learning to adjust their forecasts and to be a little bit ridiculous with their forecasts. But still, sometimes I see some forecasts, I'm like, guys, I know your goals are bigger. And they're like, oh, we don't want to oversell ourselves.
Come on.
And it's like, well, that's cool internally and setting objectives internally. But if you're trying to get money from Sand Hill Road, understand how they think and the discounting that they do.
Yeah.
It's crazy. But I got to say, the evolution of the Canadian startup ecosystem, right? What I mentioned earlier. There's a program in New York, and I think it's out here too, called the Canadian Technology Accelerator. And the CTA, they invite Canadian entrepreneurs. Well, there's an application process, and then they choose, I think, 6 or 7 companies to come down to New York and work from New York for several months. And then mentorship and training and all that stuff, a little bit like an accelerator. And the companies that were doing this program in 2011, there were a few good ones, but there were a lot that made me scratch my head. Right. And I was like, oh gosh, what is Canada producing? Now I see the companies that are coming through, and it's mind blowing. Like, wow. Yeah. All right. And it's the evolution of an ecosystem, and so many people have blogged about it and wrote PhD papers about it and all that, and all that content is true and accurate, right? But at the end of the day, New Yorkers, we didn't plan how to build an ecosystem, and we didn't systematize it and all that. It happened. It happened. There's some DoubleClick alumni and alumni from a few other companies that spun off and had their own little mafia. But at the end of the day, it was a great place to be, that had talent, that had capital, that had networks, that had everything you needed organically. And Toronto and Montreal have that also. But they're just earlier than New York was.
Wow. What an amazing tale.
Like, I see, especially the Toronto Waterloo ecosystem today, similar to New York in 2011. And so I would not be surprised if 6 years from now, Toronto Waterloo is as big as New York is today.
Wow.
And Montreal will grow in very, very similar ways. It's just, the recipe for success is in these two cities. And it's like, it's just there. And so that's why we are there. That's why we are there. Yeah.
Wow. Well, what an amazing story. This is great.
It's been so much fun, Kent.
So how do people get in touch with you if they want to,
so whitestarvc.com. Twitter handle is Lylan M, and Lylan's Lylan, then M. I actually have on my website, on my LinkedIn, so on, I actually write how to articulate my name, because I grew up, my first language was French until I was 19 years old.
Oh, wow.
And so all my friends in class.
English seems to have worked out for you too.
It did, So, I grew up speaking both, but in class, all my friends were French names. Nadia Martineau and Patrick Miron. Hey guys, I haven't seen you in 30 years. But and then the first day of class in roll call, when the teacher would come to my name, and I'd see the teacher struggle. I'm like, oh God, now the teacher's going to butcher my name, and everyone in class is going to laugh at me. It sucked.
Oh man.
But now I love it, right? Like people hear my name, Lylan Masterman. Whoa.
What a great name. All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been the Something Venture podcast. See you next time.